Marin had not expected to spend her wedding night barefoot in the snow. Yet here she was, standing at the edge of the northern forest, with frost climbing her ankles and her bridal gown dragging through the drifts behind her like a funeral shroud. The silk had turned translucent, where the wet soaked through, clinging to her legs, and her fingers had gone numb 20 minutes ago, but she kept walking because going back was not an option. Going back meant returning to the bridal chamber where she had waited for 6 hours. 6 hours on the edge of that enormous bed, with its ridiculous canopy and its mountain of furs, her hands folded in her lap, her heart hammering, her stomach sick with nerves. She had prepared herself for awkwardness. She had prepared herself for a stranger's hands and a stranger's weight, and the quiet terror of giving herself to a man she had met only once. She had braided her hair the way the handmaidens showed her. She had rubbed rose oil into her skin until it gleamed. She had sat on the edge of that bed and waited, and waited, and waited. King Caldervos had not come. Not after 1 hour, not after 3. Not after the candles burned down to pools of wax and the fire shrank to embers and the quiet pressed against her eardrums until she wanted to scream. No message, no servant sent with an explanation, no apology. Just the vast, humiliating emptiness of a room that was supposed to hold 2 people and held only 1. The tears had come around the 4th hour, hot and furious. By the 5th, the fury had burned itself out and left something worse. A calm, flat certainty that sat in her chest like a weight. He was never coming. He had never intended to come. She was a treaty obligation, a name on a document, a body delivered across the border to seal a peace accord that had nothing to do with her. And now, the peace was sealed, and she had served her purpose, and the king had gone back to whatever kings did when they were finished, pretending. So Marin had pulled on her boots, wrapped her arms around herself, and walked out the door. She had passed 2 guards in the corridor, who stared at her with open confusion but said nothing, because, what did you say to the new queen wandering the halls in her wedding dress at midnight? She had crossed the great courtyard, her boots crunching on frozen stone, and pushed through the postern gate into the forest beyond. She did not have a plan. She did not have a destination. She had nothing except the dress on her back and the growing, gnawing ache inside her that whispered she had made the worst mistake of her life by volunteering for this. The trees closed around her. The moonlight cut through the canopy in pale, fractured beams that made the snow glow faintly blue. Her breath came in short, white bursts. The cold was a living thing now, pressing against her skin, sinking into her bones, and a distant, rational part of her mind noted that she would not survive the night out here. She kept walking. Then she heard it. A sound that stopped her dead. Low and guttural and wrong, rising from somewhere deep in the tree line to her left. Not a growl exactly. Something raw, something that vibrated in her ribcage and made her teeth ache. Marin turned slowly. 2 eyes burned in the dark between the pines. Not wolf eyes. Not entirely. They were too bright, too large, glowing with a sickly amber light that pulsed like a heartbeat. The creature behind them was massive. She could see the bulk of it shifting between the trunks, could hear the crunch of snow under paws wider than her outstretched hand. It stepped into the moonlight, and Marin stopped breathing. The wolf was enormous. 3 times the size of any shifter she had ever seen. Its body twisted with unnatural muscle. Its coat matted and scarred, but it was the way it moved that terrified her. Jerking, staggering, like something was fighting inside its own skin. Its jaws hung open, and a sound poured from its throat that was not a snarl, but a scream. A long, shredded, agonized scream that sounded almost human. It was in pain. Whatever this creature was, it was suffering. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. Her legs locked. Her blood roared. The beast swung its broad head toward her, and those pulsing eyes fixed on her face, and she could see the madness in them. The complete absence of recognition. This was not a wolf. This was a thing wearing a wolf's shape, feral and mindless and dangerous beyond measure. It lunged. Marin threw her hands up, not to fight, because what could she possibly do against something that size, but in pure reflex, the way a person shields their face before impact. The beast skidded to a halt, 2 inches from her palms. Its breath was furnace hot against her frozen fingers. She could smell blood and pine, and something acrid, something chemical, like scorched metal. Its head hovered before her, trembling, its lips still pulled back over teeth, the length of her fingers, but it had stopped. Marin's breath came in shattered gasps. She could feel the heat radiating off the creature's body, could see the tremors running through its flanks. Up close, the scars were worse than she had thought. Deep, ragged furrows carved through its coat, and some of them were fresh. Still weeping, it was hurting itself, clawing at its own body in its frenzy. She did not decide to touch it. Her hand moved on its own, trembling violently, and pressed flat against the bridge of its muzzle. The beast flinched. A full-body shudder rolled through it, and the pulsing amber in its eyes flickered, then dimmed. The snarl died in its throat. The terrible tension in its body released all at once like a wire snapping, and the creature's legs buckled. It sank to the ground at her feet, its head coming to rest against her hip, and its eyes closed. Quiet rushed in to fill the space where the screaming had been. Marin stood in the snow with her hand on the beast's head, shaking so hard her vision swam, and listened to its breathing deepen into something slow and steady and impossibly peaceful. She did not move. She did not dare. At some point, the cold and the terror and the sheer overwhelming strangeness of it all became too much. Her vision darkened at the edges. She felt her knees buckle, felt herself slide down against the creature's warm flank, felt the snow soak through her dress. The last thing she registered before consciousness left her was the steady beat of a massive heart against her cheek. By dawn, the head of the king's guard found the bridal chamber empty, the bed untouched, the queen gone. By the time Hadrian reached the edge of the northern forest, following the trail of footprints in the snow, 30 guards were already searching the grounds. What he found stopped him cold. The new queen lay curled in the snow, unconscious, her wedding dress stiff with frost and her lips faintly blue, and beside her, in human form, and breathing with the deep, untroubled rhythm of true sleep, lay King Calder Voss. Hadrian stared for a long, measured moment. Then he removed his cloak, draped it over the king, and turned to the nearest guard. "Bring the girl to me when she wakes," he said, "and not a word of this to anyone." Marin woke to the smell of wood smoke and unfamiliar linen. The ceiling above her was stone, arched, and old, and for several disoriented seconds, she could not remember where she was or how she had gotten here. Then the memories arrived, not gently, and her stomach dropped. The empty bridal chamber. The forest. The beast. She sat up too quickly, and regretted it immediately. Her head swam, her muscles ached, and her skin felt raw, like she had been scrubbed with sand. She was in a small room she did not recognize, not the bridal chamber, not the infirmary. A narrow bed, a single window, with heavy curtains, drawn shut, a fire crackling in the hearth. Someone had changed her out of the ruined wedding dress, and into a plain wool nightgown. The door opened and a woman stepped inside. She was perhaps 50, sharp-eyed and angular, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe knot, and the kind of face that suggested she had never suffered a fool in her life, and did not intend to start now. "Good. You are awake," the woman said. "I am Orla, head healer of the royal household. You have been unconscious for 9 hours. Your core temperature, when they brought you in, was low enough to kill most people. You are extremely lucky, or extremely stubborn. I suspect both." Marin opened her mouth. "Do not speak yet," Orla continued, moving to the bedside table and pouring something from a clay pitcher. "Drink this first. It is willow bark and ginger. It will taste foul." It did. Marin drank it anyway, her hands trembling around the cup, and tried to organize the chaos in her head into something she could manage. The beast, that monstrous wolf in the forest. Its eyes, its scream, the way it had collapsed at her touch. And then, the part she could not stop replaying. the guards finding her in the snow beside the king. Beside the king, the wolf, Marin said. The wolf in the forest, was that? Orla's expression did not change. Not exactly, but something behind her eyes shifted, a tightening, a careful closing of a door. You will have questions, Orla said. Some of them I can answer, but there is someone who wishes to speak with you. First, a knock sounded at the door, sharp and precise. Orla opened it to reveal a tall man with a soldier's bearing and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His hair was dark, cropped close, and his eyes moved over Marin, with the detached efficiency of someone cataloging a potential threat. Miss Marin, he said, I am Hadrian, the king's beta and head of his personal guard. Are you well enough to walk? It was not really a question. Marin pushed herself out of bed on legs that felt like wet rope, and followed him into the corridor. The castle was larger than she had realized. The corridors were wide and cold, lined with stone and iron sconces that threw long flickering shadows. Servants moved past them in clusters, and every single one of them looked at Marin and then looked away too quickly. Or they suspected. The new queen, found half frozen in the snow on her wedding night. The whispers would already be spreading like water through cracks. Hadrian walked 2 paces ahead of her, his strides long and measured. He did not make small talk. He did not explain where they were going. He simply walked, and Marin followed, and with every step her anxiety wound tighter. Was the king angry? He must be angry. His new bride had walked out of the palace on their wedding night and been found unconscious in the forest beside him while he was exposed and vulnerable. If the court learned that the king had been found that way, unguarded and in shifted form, the political damage alone, Marin's stomach twisted. Hadrian stopped before a heavy oak door at the end of a long corridor and pushed it open without knocking. The room beyond was a study. Maps covered the walls. Reports and correspondence lay stacked in careful piles across a massive desk. A fire burned in a hearth, but the room was still cold, the kind of cold that seeped up from the stone floor and settled in the joints. And behind the desk sat King Calder Voss. He did not look up when they entered. His head was bent over a document, a pen in his hand, his jaw tight. He looked worse than he had at the wedding, if that was possible. The hollows beneath his eyes were deep enough to cast shadows, and his skin had a grayish cast that made him look 10 years older than he was. The sheer physical size of him was still staggering, even seated. Broad shoulders, powerful arms, hands large enough to wrap entirely around her wrist, but the size seemed less imposing now, and more like a frame, holding together something that was coming apart from the inside. He was dying, Marin thought, and the realization hit her with a clarity that felt almost violent. Whatever was happening to him, whatever that creature in the forest was, it was killing him. Sit down, Hadrian said, gesturing to a chair along the wall. Marin sat, her hands pressed together in her lap. The king kept reading. The fire crackled. The quiet stretched thin enough to snap. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The king turned pages, made notes, consulted a map pinned to the wall beside his desk. He gave no indication that he knew she was there, no acknowledgement, no glance in her direction. Marin studied the floor and tried to keep her breathing even, and wondered if this was some kind of punishment. Then she noticed his pen had stopped moving. It was subtle. His hand rested on the page, but the pen was still. His eyes were open, but unfocused, staring at the document without seeing it. His head dipped forward, just slightly, and he caught himself and straightened. Marin's breathing quickened. Another minute. His eyes grew heavy. His shoulders, rigid since she had entered, loosened by a fraction. His breathing slowed, deepened, and the pen slipped from his fingers and rolled across the desk. King Calder's head came to rest on his folded arms, and he was asleep. Marin stared at him. Then she looked at Hadrian. The beta stood motionless by the door, his gaze fixed on the king. He did not seem surprised. He seemed like a man watching a hypothesis confirm itself. "Do not move," Hadrian murmured. "Do not speak. Do not leave this room." Marin did not move. She sat in the hard chair and watched the king sleep at his desk, and felt the strangeness of it press against her like a weight she could not name. He had not slept in their bridal chamber, he had not slept at the wedding feast, but here, in a cold study, with nothing but her silent presence in the room, he had dropped into unconsciousness within 15 minutes, just like the forest. An hour passed. Then too. Hadrian did not sit, did not shift his weight, did not take his eyes off the king. Marin's back ached and her legs went numb, and she pressed her fingernails into her palms to keep from fidgeting. Finally, Hadrian turned to her and nodded toward the door. She stood on unsteady legs and slipped out of the room. Hadrian followed, pulling the door shut behind him with excruciating care. In the corridor, Marin turned to face him. What is happening to him? The beta's expression was unreadable. The king woke less than 2 minutes after you left the forest this morning, he said, ignoring her question. He has been awake ever since, 14 hours without rest. The implications settled over her like cold water. He only sleeps when I am near him, Marin said. Hadrian studied her for a long moment. His face gave nothing away, but she could feel the weight of his assessment, the careful calculation happening behind those steel-gray eyes. You will return to this room tonight, he said. Same arrangement. You sit. He works. You tell no one. And if he asks why I am here, Marin asked. He already knows, Hadrian replied. He is the one who requested it. Marin's heart lurched. One more thing, Hadrian added, already turning to leave. The king does not wish to discuss what you saw in the forest. I suggest you do not raise the subject. He was gone before she could respond. The arrangement began that night, and it was, without question, the strangest experience of Marin's life. She arrived at the king's study after the evening meal, escorted by a guard who deposited her at the door and left without a word. The room looked the same as before. Maps, reports, the fire burning low, and Calder behind his desk, writing, his posture rigid, his expression a mask of controlled exhaustion. He did not look up when she entered, he did not greet her. He did not acknowledge her existence. Marin sat in the chair along the wall, smoothed her skirt over her knees, and stared at the fire. The first night passed in total quiet. He fell asleep within 30 minutes, his head dropping to his arms with a heaviness that suggested his body had been fighting collapse for hours. Marin sat motionless until her spine burned, then crept out at dawn when Hadrian appeared at the door. The second night was the same, and the third, and the fourth. By the end of the first week, Marin had memorized every crack in the wall opposite her chair, every knot in the oak desk, every shift in the firelight across the ceiling. She had counted the maps on the walls, 14. She had counted the ink stains on his fingers, always 3, always on the right hand. She had memorized the exact moment his breathing would change, that soft, almost imperceptible deepening that meant consciousness was leaving him. It happened like a tide going out. The tension would drain from his shoulders first, then his jaw would unclench, then his hand would slow on the page, and then he would be gone. It was, she realized on the 5th night, the only time he looked peaceful. The rest of the time he looked like a man fighting a war against his own body. She was not supposed to talk to him. Hadrian had made that clear. The arrangement was transactional. She sat, he slept, she left. That was the extent of her purpose in the king's life, and she accepted it because she had spent 23 years accepting whatever role the world assigned her. But on the 6th night, her stomach growled. It was mortifyingly loud in the silent room. The sound bounced off the walls and hung in the air like an accusation. Marin pressed her palms against her abdomen and willed the floor to consume her. Calder's pen paused. He did not look up, but the corner of his mouth moved. It was not a smile, it was barely a twitch. But it was something. Have you eaten? He asked. It was the first time he had spoken to her since the arrangement began. His voice was lower than she remembered from the wedding, rougher, like it had not been used for anything but giving orders in a very long time. Yes, Marin lied. She had not. The kitchens were hostile territory. The cook and the serving staff had made it abundantly clear that the new queen, the foreign nobody who had been plucked from a border village and dropped into their palace like a stray cat, was not welcome. Meals were delivered late and cold when they were delivered at all. Calder said nothing more. The next evening when she arrived, a tray sat on the side table beside her chair. Bread, cheese, sliced apples, a small pot of honey. No explanation, no acknowledgement. Marin looked at the tray. She looked at the king. He was reading, and did not glance in her direction. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" he replied, still not looking up. Something warm flickered behind her ribs. She ate the bread and honey, and tried not to read too much into the fact that the apples had been sliced into thin, even pieces. The way she preferred, the way she had eaten them at the wedding feast, when she thought no one was watching. The trays appeared every evening after that. The food grew more varied. One night there was roasted chicken with herbs, another night a thick stew with fresh bread still warm from the oven. And one evening, tucked beside the plate, a small bunch of dried lavender tied with twine. Marin held the lavender to her nose, and breathed in, and felt something dangerous happening inside her. "You are staring," Calder said, still writing. "I am not staring," Marin replied. She was absolutely staring. He glanced up. Their eyes met for the first time in days, and the impact of it traveled down her spine, like a current. His eyes were dark, the deep gray of storm clouds, and up close they held a weariness so profound it made her ache. He looked away first. "You should eat," he said. The hush that followed was different from the ones before, thinner, and more aware. On the 9th night, Marin broke the unspoken rule and spoke without being spoken to. "Do you always work this late?" she asked. The pen stopped, a pause, long enough that she thought he would ignore her. Then, "Yes. Every night." "Every night? That seems unpleasant," she offered. He made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had any warmth in it. "It is not a matter of preference." Marin considered this. "Is it because you cannot sleep?" she asked carefully. "Or because you are afraid to?" The stillness that followed was so heavy she could feel it pressing against her eardrums. Calder's hand had gone motionless on the page. He was looking at her now, really looking, and what she saw made her wish she had not asked. Not anger, something worse. Recognition, both, he said. The word dropped into the quiet room like a stone into deep water. Marin wanted to push further, wanted to ask about the beast in the forest, about the curse that was written in every hollow of his cheeks. But the wall had come back up behind his eyes, swift and absolute, and she knew that one word was all she would get tonight. He fell asleep 12 minutes later, his head resting on his arms, his breathing deep and even. Marin sat in her chair and watched the firelight play across his features, and noticed, for the first time, the thin scars that traced along his knuckles. Not battle scars, too uniform, too deliberate, like claw marks made by his own hand. Her stomach turned. He was hurting himself. During the shifts, during the nights when the beast took hold and there was no one to quiet it, he was clawing at his own body, without knowing. Marin pressed her hand over her mouth and blinked hard against the sting in her eyes. She barely knew this man. He was her husband in name only, a stranger who would not look at her across a dinner table, who had left her alone on their wedding night without a word. She had no reason to care, but she looked at those scars and she cared. She looked at the shadows carved into his cheeks, and the way sleep had softened the rigid line of his mouth into something almost young, almost vulnerable, and she cared so fiercely it frightened her. 3 nights later, Hadrian called her aside before she entered the study. "The king has made a decision," the Beta said, his expression carefully neutral. "The arrangement will change. You will no longer sit in his study in the evenings." Marin's heart sank. "Instead," Hadrian continued, "you will sleep in his chambers. A separate bed has been prepared for you." Marin stared at him. "His chambers," she repeated. "Where he sleeps, where the king sleeps." "Where the king will attempt to sleep, yes, but we are not. We have not." She felt heat crawl up her neck and flood her face. "The marriage is not consummated." Hadrian's expression remained perfectly blank. "The arrangement is medical in nature. You will sleep in a separate bed on the far side of the room. Nothing more." Marin's face burned hotter. Of course. No, I know that. I was not suggesting. I understand completely. Hadrian looked at her the way one might look at a small animal that had walked into a wall. Good. The guard will escort you at sundown. The king's chambers were enormous. That was the first thing Marin registered when the heavy doors swung open. A ceiling lost in shadow, walls lined with weapons and old banners, a hearth large enough to stand in, and at the center of it all, the bed. It was absurdly massive, carved from dark wood, draped in furs and heavy linen. And on the far side of the room, pushed against the wall like an afterthought, a narrow cot with a thin mattress and a single blanket. Marin looked at the cot. She looked at the king's bed. She looked at the cot again. The proportions here are interesting, she said to no one. A sound came from behind her, almost a laugh, and she spun around. Quolder stood in the doorway of what she assumed was his dressing room, watching her. He was in shirt sleeves, his jacket removed, and the sight of him in anything less than full, formal attire sent a strange jolt through her nervous system. "It is adequate," he said, nodding toward the cot. "For a child, perhaps," Marin replied. "Or a particularly small dog." Something moved across his expression. The ghost of amusement, faint and fleeting, like sunlight through heavy cloud. "If you are uncomfortable," he began. "I have slept in worse places, Your Majesty," she said quickly, moving to the cot and sitting down. The mattress was barely thicker than a folded blanket. "Much worse. This is perfectly fine." He lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching her with an expression she could not decipher. Then he crossed to the bed, pulled back the furs, and lay down on his back, fully clothed. Boot still on. "You are not going to change?" Marin asked before she could stop herself. He stiffened. "No, you are sleeping in your boots. I am aware. That cannot possibly be comfortable." "It is not a matter of comfort," he said, and something in his voice made her stop pushing. Marin lay down on the cot, pulled the thin blanket to her chin, and stared at the ceiling. She could hear him breathing. Deep, controlled, deliberate, the sound of a man forcing his body to relax through sheer willpower. The fire crackled. Shadows shifted across the walls. Minutes passed. Marin counted them, tracking the rhythm of his breathing, waiting for the change. It came faster than it had in the study. His breath deepened within 10 minutes. His body released its iron tension. She heard the soft sound of his head turning on the pillow, settling. He was asleep. And then, at the edges of her awareness, she felt something else. A tremor. Not physical, not something she could see or hear, but something she could feel in the marrow of her bones. A vibration that pulsed beneath his skin like a second heartbeat. Dark and hungry and waiting. The curse. She could feel the curse. It was pressing against him even in sleep, testing the edges, looking for a way in, and her presence somehow was holding it back, like a wall, like a door held shut against a storm. Marin lay in the dark and listened to the king breathe, and felt the thing inside him, pushing, 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 and wondered how long the door could hold. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of their arrangement settled into something almost ordinary. Almost. Every evening Marin arrived at the king's chambers after supper, set up her things on the narrow cot, and went about the quiet business of preparing for sleep. Every morning she woke before him, dressed in the dim gray light, and returned to the small room Orla had assigned her near the infirmary before the palace stirred. During the days, she did not see him. Their lives ran on parallel tracks that never crossed. He held court, met with commanders, reviewed border reports, and carried the weight of a kingdom on shoulders that grew thinner by the week. She worked in the infirmary alongside Orla, grinding herbs, mixing tinctures, treating the minor ailments of castle staff who looked at her sideways and called her the border girl when they thought she could not hear. She learned to ignore it. She had been ignoring things her entire life. One more slight added to the pile barely registered anymore, but the nights were something else entirely. In the beginning, she had been terrified of the hush between them. It felt accusatory, like the quiet itself was reminding her that she did not belong in this room, in this man's presence, in this life. But slowly, imperceptibly, that hush changed shape. It became familiar, comfortable, even. The way shared quiet can become its own language between two people who spend enough time breathing the same air. She noticed things about him that no one else would ever see. The way he always read the last report of the evening twice, as if his mind could not trust itself to absorb information properly through the fog of exhaustion. The way he rubbed the back of his neck when his thoughts grew heavy. The way his handwriting deteriorated across the page as sleep crept closer. The letters growing wider and less controlled, until the final word before he dropped was always illegible. She noticed, too, the things he tried to hide. The tremor in his hands that came and went. The way he would sometimes pause mid-sentence, his pen hovering, his eyes going distant and dark, like something inside him had pulled his attention inward. Those moments frightened her more than anything, because in those moments he did not look like a king. He looked like a man being pulled under by something no one else could see. One evening, she arrived to find a second blanket folded on her cot. Maren picked it up and ran her thumb over the fabric. It was thick, finely woven, far nicer than anything in the servants' stores. She glanced at Calder. He was reading, and did not acknowledge her. "Thank you for the blanket," she said. "What blanket?" he replied. Not looking up, Maren bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. On another night, she found a small oil lamp on the table beside her cot, positioned so that the light fell across the pillow without reaching the main bed. She had mentioned once, not to him, but to the air itself while arranging her things, that the darkness made the room difficult to navigate if she needed water during the night. She had not expected anyone to hear. She certainly had not expected anyone to care. "The lamp is useful," she said that evening. "Hadrian arranged it," Calder said, turning a page. "Hadrian does not strike me as a man who concerns himself with lamplight placement." The page turned again. The faintest flush crept along the tips of his ears. Something warm and terrifying unfurled inside Maren's ribs. A week later, a jar of salve appeared on her bedside table with a note in handwriting she did not recognize. "For the cold, nothing else." She unscrewed the lid, and the smell hit her. Beeswax and wintergreen, and something faintly herbal. The kind of warming balm meant for aching joints and frozen fingers. She had complained to Orla that morning about the cold settling into her hands at night, making it hard to grip the pestle the next day. Orla worked in the infirmary. Calder never visited the infirmary, which meant he had asked Orla about her, which meant he had been paying attention. The realization made her feel exposed in a way she could not explain, like standing in sunlight after years in shadow. Uncomfortable, but warm. She started talking to him, not about anything that mattered, not at first. She told him about the guardsman who had come in with a splinter in his thumb and nearly fainted at the sight of the tweezers. She told him about the kitchen cat that kept sneaking into the herb stores and sleeping on the dried mint. She told him about the old shepherd from her village, who claimed he could predict the weather by the behavior of his goats, and was right more often than he was wrong. She told him these things not because she expected him to respond, but because the darkness before sleep had become a space she felt compelled to fill. If she was going to sit in this man's room every night while he fought to quiet his own mind, the least she could do was give him something else to listen to. He never responded. Not once in the first week. But on the 8th night, as she finished a story about Orla catching the kitchen cat red-pawed in the chamomile stores and launching into a lecture that the cat apparently sat through with perfect attention, Calder made a sound. It was quiet, barely audible, muffled behind his hand. But it was a laugh. Maren froze. She looked at him across the room and found him with his head slightly bowed, his hand over his mouth, his shoulders shaking with the effort of containing it. He caught her looking, and the laugh disappeared behind a cough. "Apologies," he said stiffly. "Continue." "You laughed," Maren said, unable to keep the wonder out of her voice. "I did not. You absolutely did. It was a cough." "It was a laugh, disguised as a cough, Your Majesty, and I will accept it as the highest compliment I have ever received." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had that first night when she asked if he was afraid to sleep. And for the span of a single breath, the wall behind his eyes came down and she saw him. Not the king, not the curse. Just a man so exhausted and so isolated that a story about a cat had made him laugh, for what might have been the first time in months. Then the wall went back up. He returned to his reading. But the air in the room had changed. Something had cracked open between them, small and fragile and new, and they both knew it. After that, the stories became a ritual. She told him one every night. Some were funny, some were sad, some were nothing at all. Just memories from a border village that no one in this castle would ever care about. But she told them anyway, and he listened, and the listening was its own kind of intimacy. She noticed he fell asleep faster on the nights she talked, as though her voice was a rope he could follow down into rest, something steady, to hold on to while the darkness pulled at him. The following night, he asked her a question. "The shepherd," he said without preamble, "the one with the goats, was he accurate about the early frost?" Marin blinked at him from the cot. "You remember?" That his jaw tightened. "You told me 3 nights ago. I do not forget things." He sounded almost defensive. Marin felt something catch in her throat. "Yes," she said softly. "He was right. He was always right. The village said he was touched by the old magic, but I think he just paid very close attention to what most people ignored." Calder was quiet for a long moment. "That sounds like someone else I know," he said. Marin's heart stopped, then restarted with a kick that rattled her ribs. She opened her mouth to respond, but his breathing had already changed. Deeper, slower. His eyes had closed, and the rigid set of his jaw had softened into something almost gentle. He was asleep. Marin lay in the dark, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, that single sentence turning over and over in her mind. "That sounds like someone else I know." She folded her hands over her stomach and willed her pulse to slow. It did not. 3 days later, Orla sat Marin down in the back room of the infirmary and closed the door. The head healer stood with her arms crossed, leaning against the work table, her expression grave. She was silent for a long moment, studying Marin the way she studied a wound she was not sure she could treat. "How long have you been sleeping in his chambers?" Orla asked. "Almost a month," Marin replied. "And how long does he sleep when you are there?" 5 or 6 hours usually, sometimes more," Orla nodded slowly. "Before you arrived, do you know how long he slept?" Marin shook her head. She had guessed, of course. Looking at him, the shadows, the tremors, the way his body seemed to burn through itself from the inside, but guessing and knowing were different things. "Minutes," Orla said. "Some nights, nothing at all. He has not slept properly in over a year, not since the siege." The word landed like a fist. "What siege?" Marin asked. Orla's mouth thinned. She moved to the far shelf and pulled down a small leather-bound journal, old and cracked at the spine, and set it on the table between them. "The Ashenmoor siege," she said, 9 months ago. A rogue pack called the Greymaw held a mountain pass on the northern border. Their alpha, a man named Declan, believed the crown had abandoned the outlying settlements. There were raids, villages burned, innocent people killed. Marin's stomach tightened. The king marched north to end it. He offered terms. Declan refused. The battle lasted 3 days. Orla paused. "I will not describe what happened on those mountains, child. You do not need those images in your head." But the king came back different, broken in a way that bones and herbs cannot fix. "The curse," Marin whispered. Orla looked at her sharply. "What do you know about that?" "I know something is inside him," Marin said, the words spilling out. "I can feel it at night. It presses against him when he sleeps, like something trying to break through, and when he shifts." She trailed off, remembering the beast in the forest, the screaming, the pulsing amber glow. "His wolf is corrupted," Orla said quietly. "Declan's mother was a bone witch. Before she died, she cursed the king. We do not know the exact nature of it. We know the effects. He cannot sleep without being dragged into a place of suffering. His wolf has become something unrecognizable, And both are getting worse. Marin felt the blood drain from her face. Worse how? The shifts are more violent, more frequent. He loses control for longer. Last month, before you came, he shifted in the west courtyard and nearly killed 2 of his own guards before Hadrian brought him down. Orla's voice was steady, clinical, but her hands gripped the edge of the table hard enough to whiten her knuckles. The healers have tried everything in their power, every remedy, every counter-curse, every old magic in the archives. Nothing works except me, Marin said. The quiet that followed was deafening. We do not understand why, Orla admitted. The leading theory is your scent. Some wolves carry a pheromonal signature with sedative properties, rare but documented. Combined with the herbal compounds you absorb through your work here, the effect seems to suppress the curse at close range. Suppress, Marin repeated. Not cure. No, Orla said, not cure. The word hung between them, heavy with everything it implied. She was a bandage on a wound that was still bleeding, a finger pressed against a crack in a dam. The curse was not gone. It was waiting. How long does he have? Marin asked. Orla looked away. Hadrian believes 6 months, perhaps less. The shifts are accelerating. Each one tears his body apart and puts it back together worse than before. Even an alpha cannot sustain that indefinitely. Marin sat very still. The room felt smaller than it had a moment ago, the walls pressing inward, the air thicker. 6 months. The man who slept beside her every night, whose hand found hers in the dark, whose rare, reluctant laughter had become the best part of her day, had 6 months to live. She blinked hard and pressed her knuckles against the table. Does he know? She asked. He has known from the beginning, Orla said quietly. Why do you think he agreed to the marriage? A dying king needs an alliance secured before the end. You were the treaty, the peace accord with your people. He did not expect to survive long enough to be a husband to you. The words hit her with a force that stole her breath. Every humiliation of that wedding night, the empty chamber, the absence, the cold dismissal, rearranged itself in her mind like shattered glass, reforming into a window she could finally see through. He had not abandoned her out of cruelty. He had abandoned her because he believed he was already dead. And suddenly, every small gesture, the blanket, the lamp, the salve, the sliced apples, took on a weight that made her throat close. A dying man, rationing out tiny kindnesses he did not believe he had the right to give. Marin stood from the table, her legs unsteady. I need air, she managed. Orla caught her arm gently. There is something else. The data we have gathered suggests that physical proximity increases the suppressive effect. The closer you are, the deeper he sleeps. The longer the curse stays dormant. Marin understood the implication before Orla finished the sentence. You want me to sleep closer to him, she said. I want him to survive, Orla corrected. And right now, you are the only thing keeping him alive. That night, a second pillow appeared on the king's bed, not beside his own pillows. At the foot of the bed, near the edge, separated by several feet of mattress, a compromise, an offer. Marin stood in the doorway staring at it. Calder sat on the edge of the bed, with his back to her, his shirt removed, and the sight of his bare shoulders hit her like a wave, broad and powerful, tapering to a narrow waist, his skin mapped with scars she had never seen before. Not just the self-inflicted marks on his knuckles. These were deeper, longer. Ragged trenches that carved across his shoulder blades and down his spine, in patterns that looked like something had tried to claw its way out of him from the inside. Her breath caught. He heard it. He turned his head slightly, caught her staring, and something complicated moved through his expression. You do not have to do this, he said. I know, Marin replied. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She moved to the bed and sat on the edge near the second pillow. The mattress was softer than anything she had ever slept on. It felt like sinking into warm water. The distance between them was vast enough to be proper. Close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his skin. For the record, Marin said, tucking her legs beneath the covers, I am not doing this because Orla told me to, or because Hadrian arranged it. I am doing it because you look like you have not slept well in a year, and I happen to be good at sleeping, and it seems rude not to share. Something passed through his expression, not amusement, not quite. Something warmer and more startled than that, like he had forgotten what it felt like to be spoken to as a person, rather than a title. "Good night, Marin," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name. Her heart fractured. "Good night, Your Majesty." He lay back. She lay back. The distance between them hummed with something neither of them named. He fell asleep in 7 minutes. Marin counted every one, and in the dark, she felt the curse pressing against the edges of his mind, patient and relentless, and she pressed back with nothing but her presence and her stubbornness, and the ferocious, terrifying tenderness that was growing inside her like a vine she could not cut. She did not sleep for a very long time. When she finally drifted off, her hand had somehow crossed the space between them and come to rest against the back of his. She did not remember reaching for him, but she woke in the middle of the night to find his fingers wrapped around hers, tight and desperate, holding on like she was the only solid thing left in the world. It happened on a Tuesday. Marin had been sleeping in his bed for 2 weeks. The arrangement had settled into its own rhythm, separate pillows, careful distance, his hand finding hers somewhere in the dark of each night, like a compass finding north. They did not speak about the hand-holding. They did not speak about the way she sometimes woke, with his arm draped across the space between them, his fingertips resting against her hip like they had wandered there, of their own accord. They did not speak about any of it, but on Tuesday everything broke apart. Marin woke to the sound of screaming, not a human scream, something deeper and more primal, a sound that vibrated through the walls and shook dust from the ceiling. She jolted upright, her heart slamming, and found the bed beside her empty. The sheets were shredded, long claw marks raked through the linen and into the mattress beneath. Dark stains spotted the fabric, still fresh. Marin threw herself out of bed and ran for the door. The corridor was chaos. Guards sprinted past her, swords drawn, their faces rigid with barely contained fear. Someone was shouting orders from the direction of the courtyard. She followed the noise, barefoot, her nightgown whipping around her ankles, and burst through the doors into the east courtyard. The beast was there, massive and wrong and thrashing against the chains that 4 men were struggling to hold. Its coat was matted and damp, and the screaming that poured from its throat was the same agonized, shredded sound she remembered from the forest. Its eyes burned amber in the torchlight, rolling with a madness that had no recognition in it. No intelligence, no king. Hadrian stood at the edge of the courtyard with his sword drawn, his jaw set in grim calculation. Beside him, 2 guards lay motionless on the ground. "Get her out of here," Hadrian commanded without looking at Marin. She did not move. The beast swung its head toward her, and for one terrible moment those amber eyes locked on her face. The creature lunged against the chains, and the men holding them staggered forward, their boots skidding on the cobblestones. Marin walked toward it. "Stop!" Hadrian's voice cracked like a whip behind her. "That is a direct order." She kept walking, her bare feet slapped against cold stone. Her blood roared in her ears so loudly, she could barely hear the shouting around her. The beast snarled, a wall of sound and fury that should have stopped her dead. She raised her hand. The creature flinched, just like the forest, a full-body shudder that rippled through its frame, and the snarl died in its throat. Its eyes flickered, amber dimming to something darker, something almost recognizable. Marin pressed her palm against the beast's muzzle, and it collapsed. The chains went slack. The courtyard fell silent except for the ragged breathing of the guards, and the slow, deep rhythm of the creature's lungs as it sank to the ground at her feet. Marin knelt beside it, her hand trembling against its scarred fur, and felt the tremor beneath its skin, the curse, coiled and hungry, pressing against the boundary of her touch, but receding. Slowly, reluctantly, pulling back like a tide, dragged out by the moon, the beast shrank. The terrible unnatural size of it diminished, bones shifting and reshaping beneath the skin until the wolf was gone, and there was only a man lying broken and human on the cold cobblestones, his chest heaving, his skin sheened with sweat. Calder opened his eyes and looked up at her. The horror on his face was absolute, not at what he had done, at the fact that she was there, that she had seen him, that she was kneeling on the cold stone with her hand on his cheek, and no fear in her eyes. "Why did you not run?" he whispered. Marin opened her mouth to answer and then felt it, something shifting at the base of her skull. A pull, deep and disorienting, like the world was tilting sideways. Calder's eyes widened. "No," he said, and there was such terror in that single word that it stopped her breath. The courtyard dissolved. Marin blinked, and she was somewhere else, somewhere cold. The air tasted of ash and sorrow, and the stillness was so complete it felt like being buried alive. Gray fog pressed in from every direction, thick and deliberate, and the ground beneath her feet was soft in a way that made her skin crawl. Not earth, something else, something wrong. She did not know what to call this place. It felt like a wound given form, a prison built from grief. She turned, and he was there, standing 10 feet away, staring into the fog with the same defeated stillness she had seen in the forest. But this time she could feel what he felt. The curse had dragged her through, and whatever connection held between them had opened like a door. His pain hit her like a wall of water, guilt so massive it had its own gravity. Grief so dense it had compressed into something physical, something that pressed against his lungs and made every breath a labor. Figures moved in the fog, soldiers, civilians, children. Marin's knees buckled. "You should not be here," Calder said, his voice flat and distant. The figures drifted closer, their mouths moved, whispering, accusing, a chorus of the dead demanding an audience with a man who had survived. A boy stepped forward, perhaps 12 years old, with dark hair and wide eyes and a wound across his chest that would never close. Calder made a sound that was barely human. "Please," Marin gasped, reaching for him. "We need to leave. We need to wake up. You need to leave," he said. "I belong here." The words were so quiet and so certain that they pierced her like a blade. Then the fog rushed in and the cursed place swallowed her whole. Marin woke, gasping on the courtyard stones. Hadrian was kneeling beside her, his face tight with controlled panic. Calder lay unconscious on the ground nearby, a cloak thrown over him, his chest rising and falling with the deep rhythm of drugged sleep. "How long?" Marin managed, her voice raw. "Seconds," Hadrian said. "You both collapsed at the same time. Seconds." It had felt like an eternity. "Get me away from him," Marin whispered. "He is going to be furious when he wakes up." She was right. The summons came the next morning, not through Hadrian. Through a guard, cold-faced and formal. The king wished to see her immediately. Calder's study was suffocating when she entered. He stood behind his desk, dressed and rigid, and the look on his face made her insides turn to ice. "You entered the place where the curse takes me," he said without preamble. "I did not choose to enter it," Marin replied, keeping her voice steady through force of will. "The curse pulled me in, which is exactly why this arrangement is ending." His voice was flat and controlled and utterly without warmth. "You will return to the room near the infirmary. You will no longer come to my chambers." Marin stared at him. "If I stop sleeping near you, the curse will. That is my concern, not yours. You will die," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. Something moved behind his eyes. Pain, deep and raw. But his jaw set harder, and his hands pressed flat against the desk, and he looked at her with the deliberate coldness of a man building a wall, as fast as he could. "You are relieved of this duty," he said, effective immediately. "That is an order from your king." The word duty landed like a slap. 6 weeks of sitting in his room, of filling his silences with stories, of holding his hand in the dark, of watching him sleep and feeling his pain and pressing back against the curse with everything she had. Duty. "Your Majesty, please listen to me," Marin began. "Leave," he said. "But if you would. Just." "I said leave." The roar in his voice shook the windows. Marin flinched. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to shed in front of him. She turned and walked out of the room, and did not look back. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall and pressed her hands over her mouth and broke. The days that followed were the worst of her life. She returned to her small room near the infirmary and tried to resume her old routine and found that nothing fit anymore. The room was too quiet, the bed was too cold. The absence of his breathing beside her was a physical ache that settled behind her sternum and would not leave. She could not eat. The food turned to ash in her mouth. She could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the cursed place pressing at the edges of her consciousness, no longer held back by the proximity of his body, leaking through in fragments of gray fog and distant screaming. The migraines began on the third day, blinding, vicious, pulsing behind her eyes, with a rhythm that matched the thing she had felt beneath his skin. The curse was reaching for her now, too. Not to trap her, but to remind her of what she had left behind. By the fifth day, she could barely stand. The room spun when she moved too quickly. Her hands shook when she tried to grind herbs. Orla watched her with increasing alarm but said nothing, which was somehow worse than a lecture. She caught glimpses of him across the castle, a shadow at the end of a corridor, a broad-shouldered silhouette in a window across the courtyard. Once, passing through the great hall, she heard his voice, and the sound of it hit her like a blow to the chest. She stopped walking and stood perfectly still, and let the pain wash over her. He never looked at her. Not once. But she could see the cost. The shadows beneath his eyes had deepened to bruises. His skin had taken on the grayish pallor of a man running on fumes. His movements, always controlled, had become stiff and mechanical, like his body was a machine. He was operating through sheer willpower. He was not sleeping. The curse was consuming him. On the seventh night, Marin woke to the sound of howling, distant, agonized, tearing across the frozen grounds from somewhere deep in the forest. She sat up in the dark, her heart hammering, and felt the curse pulse against her, like a second heartbeat. He had shifted again, alone, without her. She pressed her palms against her ears and squeezed her eyes shut, and tried to breathe through the terror that was flooding her veins. "I have to go back to him," she whispered into the dark. But he had ordered her to stay away. He had stripped the warmth from his voice and the recognition from his eyes, and made himself a stranger. He had done it to protect her. She knew that. She understood it. But understanding did not stop the ache. The howling went on for hours. By dawn, it had stopped. But the absence of sound it left behind was worse. Marin lasted 9 days before her body made the decision for her. She was in the infirmary, grinding feverfew at the workbench. Her hands trembling so badly, the pestle kept slipping. The room tilted gently to the left, then corrected, then tilted again. She gripped the edge of the table and willed the world to hold still. It did not. Orla had been watching her from across the room, with the careful, measured attention of a healer assessing a patient who would not admit they were a patient. "Sit down, child," Orla said. "I am fine," Marin replied. And then the floor rushed up to meet her. She did not remember hitting the ground. She did not remember the sound Orla made, sharp and commanding, calling for the guards. She did not remember anything until the world returned in fragments. Stone, ceiling, firelight. Voices overlapping in tense, urgent tones, and a hand gripping hers so tightly it hurt. Marin's eyes focused slowly. She was in the infirmary, on one of the narrow cots, and Calder was beside her. He looked destroyed, not angry, not kingly, not controlled, destroyed. His skin was ashen, his eyes red-rimmed and wild, and his free hand hovered over her like he wanted to touch her everywhere at once, but was afraid she would shatter. "You collapsed," he said, and his voice was so raw it barely sounded like him. "Your heart stopped for 11 seconds. Marin blinked at him. "That seems dramatic." He made a sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and his forehead dropped against their joined hands. His shoulders shook once, hard, and then he forced them still. Orla stood near the doorway, arms crossed, her expression a a complicated mixture of vindication and genuine fear. Your Majesty, Orla said carefully, I would like to explain what is happening to her, with your permission. Tell me, Calder said without lifting his head. She is dying, Orla said. And so are you. For the same reason. The stillness that followed was so absolute Marin could hear the fire breathing in the hearth. Explain. Orla moved into the room, pulling the door firmly shut behind her. The bond between you is not simply chemical. It is not just her scent suppressing the curse. It is a mate bond, incomplete, and fighting to close, and the longer you hold it open, the more it will tear you both apart. Marin drew a sharp breath. She looked at Calder and found him staring at Orla with an expression she had never seen before, not shock, recognition. The dull, resigned recognition of a man hearing aloud what he had already known. You knew, Marin whispered. He did not deny it. How long? She asked, and her voice cracked. Since the forest, he said quietly. Since you touched my wolf, and it stopped fighting. Wolves do not stop for strangers. Marin. They stop for one person. The tears came before she could catch them. Then, why did you send me away? His hand tightened around hers, and the pain that moved through his expression was so naked, it made her want to look away. Because the bond ties your life to mine, he said, and my life is ending. The curse is winning. Every night it takes more of me, and when it finally takes everything, anyone bonded to me will follow. His jaw clenched hard enough to whiten. I would rather die alone than drag you into the dark with me. Marin stared at him through blurred vision. You selfless, stubborn fool, she whispered. Orla cleared her throat. If I may. The curse is indeed growing stronger, but that does not mean it cannot be fought. What concerns me is that it should not still be this powerful bone witch. Curses of this type are parasitic. They feed on something in the host, and when that something is depleted, they wither. She paused, her gaze sharpening. Yours has not withered, Your Majesty, which means it is still being fed. Calder went very still. Fed by what? Guilt, Orla said flatly. Grief. Self-punishment. Whatever you carry from that siege, you have been feeding this curse every night like kindling on a fire. It is not surviving on magic alone. It is surviving on you. The color drained from Calder's face. He released Marin's hand and stood crossing to the window. His back was a rigid wall of tension, his shoulders drawn up tight, and Marin could see the muscles in his jaw working as he fought to maintain control. Tell us, Marin said, pushing herself upright on the cot despite the runes swimming around her. Tell us what happened at Ashenmoor. The real story, not the version in the reports. He braced his hands against the windowsill. The stillness stretched. Marin did not feel it. She waited, and the waiting was its own kind of courage. There was a girl, Calder said at last, and his voice was barely audible. A shepherd's daughter from one of the border settlements. 14 years old. Her name was Elspeth. She came to us during the third night of the siege, carrying a white banner and a message from the civilians trapped inside the pass. His knuckles whitened against the stone. They wanted to surrender. Declan's warriors would not allow it, but the families, the children, they wanted out. Elspeth had slipped through the lines at night to reach us. She was terrified, but she spoke clearly. She had rehearsed what she was going to say. She had memorized the number of families, the number of children. She had counted them all. Marin's throat tightened. I told her to go back, Calder continued. Each word dragged out like a splinter from flesh. I told her we would hold fire at dawn and open a corridor for the civilians. I gave her my word. I looked a 14-year-old girl in the eye and promised her that her people would be safe. His head dropped between his shoulders, but the corridor was ambushed. Declan had anticipated it. He used his own people as shields, the very families Elspeth had counted and named. And when the fighting started, the girl, he stopped. The room held its breath. She was running toward our line, with the white banner still in her hands. My archers did not see the banner. They saw a movement, a breath that sounded like it cost him everything. She died 30 paces from safety. I held her body afterward. She was still holding the banner. She had tied it around her wrist so she would not drop it. Marin pressed her hand over her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. Every night, Calder whispered, the curse shows her to me. Every night she runs. Every night I fail to stop it. And every night she looks at me and asks why I did not save her. But you tried, Marin said, her voice thick. You opened the corridor. You gave your word. My word killed her, he said. My arrogance killed her. I believed I could control a battlefield, and a child paid the price. Orla spoke quietly, and that is what feeds the curse, not the memory. The belief that you deserve to be punished for it. Calder said nothing. His stillness was its own answer. Marin wiped her eyes. Will you let me help you? He turned to face her. The look in his eyes was the loneliest thing she had ever seen. I cannot let you die for me, Marin. Then let me live with you, she said. Let me fight beside you, but stop trying to save me by destroying yourself. He stared at her across the room, and she watched the war play out behind his eyes. The desire to protect her pulling against the desperate, aching need to let her in. Please, she said. Let me stay. His resolve broke. She saw it happen, the exact moment the wall came down, and it was not dramatic or explosive. It was quiet. His shoulders dropped, his fists unclenched, his eyes closed. Stay, he said. She returned to his chambers that night. Neither of them spoke as they climbed the stairs. The castle was quiet around them, the corridors dim and empty, and their footsteps echoed off the stone in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Marin's pulse hammered in her throat, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of what was happening. She was choosing this. He was letting her. The door closed behind them, and they stood in the familiar room, the massive bed, the dying fire, the weapons on the walls, and looked at each other with the raw, unguarded honesty of two people who had run out of walls to hide behind. I need to tell you something, Marin said. Calder watched her waiting. I volunteered for this marriage, she said. Not because I wanted to be queen, not because I wanted power or safety or a title. I volunteered because no one else would. She swallowed hard. My village needed the treaty. The pack elders called for a bride. And every woman with a family, with a name, with something to lose, refused. So I stepped forward, because I had nothing to lose. Her voice dropped. I have spent my entire life being the person no one would miss if she disappeared, the one who could be spared. Calder's expression shifted. Something raw and furious and achingly tender moved through his eyes. You are not that person, he said, and his voice held a conviction so absolute it shook her. You were never that person. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took her face in his hands, and the contact sent a shockwave through every nerve in her body. His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, wiping away tears she had not realized were falling. I spent 6 hours on our wedding night pacing the corridor outside your door, he said, his forehead resting against hers. 6 hours trying to make myself walk in and be the husband you deserved. But I could feel the curse clawing at the inside of my chest, and I was afraid. His voice broke. I was afraid I would shift in my sleep and hurt you, that the beast would wake beside you and you would see what I really am. I have already seen, Marin whispered. I knelt beside the beast on the cobblestones and put my hand on its face, and it lay down. You do not frighten me. Calder, you should be frightened, he said. Probably, she agreed. But I am done being sensible about this. She kissed him. It was not gentle. It was the kiss of a woman who had spent weeks holding herself back, and the sound he made against her mouth, low and desperate and aching with relief, unraveled every knot of restraint she had left. His hand slid into her hair and he kissed her back with a ferocity that stole the breath from her lungs. He pulled her closer, closer, like the distance between them was an injury he was trying to heal through sheer force. If we do this, he said, against her lips, his breathing ragged, the bond will complete. There is no going back. I know, if the curse takes me, it will take you too. Then we fight it together, Marin said. And if we lose, at least we lose together. He looked at her with eyes full of 1,000 things he had never allowed himself to feel, and then the last wall fell. What followed was overwhelming. in the best possible way. Tender and fierce and raw and reverent, two people who had been starving for each other finally allowed to be close. Every touch was a confession, every breath was a promise. When the mate bond snapped into place, it was not sudden. It was inevitable, a warmth that bloomed in her and spread through every vein, golden and humming and alive, connecting her to him in a way that went beyond skin and bone. She felt his heart beating in time with hers, felt his breath sinking to her rhythm, felt the raw, staggering force of his love pouring through the bond like sunlight through a shattered window. She pressed her forehead against his shoulder at the same moment. He pressed his lips to her throat, and the bond sealed with a resonance that vibrated through the walls and made the fire in the hearth flare white. They lay tangled together afterward, his arms wrapped around her, her head on his chest, their breathing slowly returning to earth. "Sleep," Marin murmured against his skin. "I am here." He surrendered to it like a man who had finally been given permission to stop fighting. His breathing deepened, his body went heavy and warm against hers, and within minutes he was asleep. Marin closed her eyes and let the bond hum between them, and followed him under. The hollow was waiting. He had called it that once. She remembered. The hollow. And now, standing in the gray fog, with the bond blazing between them, she understood why. It was a place where everything had been carved out. Hope, warmth, forgiveness, all hollowed away, leaving only the raw architecture of guilt. It was different this time. She could feel everything through the bond. Every layer of his grief, his guilt, his self-loathing, laid bare before her like pages of a book she could finally read. The dead surrounded them. Soldiers, civilians, wolves in human form, all watching with empty eyes. And at the center, as she knew she would be, stood Elspeth. The girl was small and young and heartbreaking. She held the white banner in her hands, tied around her wrist, the way Calder had described, and the wound in her chest wept silently. Calder dropped to his knees. Marin felt his agony through the bond, so consuming she nearly buckled beneath it. But she steadied herself and knelt beside him and took his hand. "Look at them," she said softly. He did. The dead watched him with empty eyes, and their mouths moved with the words the curse put there. His words. His guilt-given voice and shape and teeth. "They are not saying this," Marin said. "The curse takes what you believe about yourself and makes you hear it from their mouths. But these are your words, Calder. Your punishment. And you have to decide if you are going to keep feeding it." His hand trembled in hers. "I was supposed to protect them," he said. "You were supposed to try," Marin replied. "And you did. You offered peace. You opened the corridor. You held Elspeth when she fell. You carried every single one of their names home with you, and you have not put them down for a single day." Her voice thickened with tears. "I know what it feels like to believe you are not enough. I have believed it my entire life. That if I had been different, better, more worthy, someone would have chosen me. But the truth is that I was enough. I was always enough. And the people who could not see it were wrong, not me." She turned to face him, gripping both of his hands now. "You were enough, Calder. You fought for your people and you failed in the way that every human being fails when the world is bigger and crueler than any one person can hold. That is not a debt, it is a wound, and wounds are meant to heal." She looked at Elspeth's ghost and spoke directly to her. "He remembers you. He will always remember you, but you have to let him go now, and he has to let you rest." The fog trembled. Calder made a sound, a deep, wrenching sob that came from somewhere so far inside him. Marin was not sure it had ever been touched before. His head dropped against their joined hands and his shoulders shook. "I am sorry," he said to the girl. "I am sorry I was not fast enough." Elspeth looked at him. The accusation in her eyes softened. She lowered the banner, slowly, and the stain on her chest began to fade. One by one, the dead turned away. They dissolved into the fog, like smoke into open sky, their voices fading to whispers, then to nothing at all. Elspeth was the last. She looked at Calder, then at Marin, and something that might have been gratitude moved across her features. She closed her eyes and was gone. The fog lifted. The hollow collapsed inward, folding into itself like a dream dissolving at the edges, and the gray was replaced by warmth, by the golden hum of the bond, by the steady, certain rhythm of two hearts beating together. Marin caught him as he fell against her, and she held him while the grief poured out, and she did not let go. "I have you," she whispered. "I have you." They woke together in the warm dark of his chambers, foreheads touching, fingers intertwined. Calder's eyes were wet but clear, clearer than she had ever seen them. He smiled, small and fragile and real. "Thank you," he said. Marin kissed his forehead. "You are welcome, Your Majesty," he laughed, quiet and broken and beautiful. They fell back to sleep together, and for the first time in over a year, nothing followed him into the dark. The curse did not vanish overnight. Calder still woke in the dark sometimes, his breathing sharp, his hands reaching for ghosts that were no longer there. The guilt did not evaporate simply because he had chosen to release it. That was not how grief worked. It came in waves, and some nights the waves were taller than others. But Marin was always there. She held him when the nightmares came, and listened when the memories demanded to be spoken aloud, and said nothing when quiet was what he needed. She learned the geography of his grief, the way she had once learned herbs, with patience and attention, and the understanding that healing was not a destination, but a direction. The shifts grew less violent, then less frequent. Then, gradually, they stopped altogether. His wolf returned to him slowly, not the monstrous, corrupted thing that had screamed in the forest, but something calmer, something that lay beside Marin in the snow behind the castle and let her scratch behind its ears while it rumbled with the contentment she could feel through the bond, like warm water. The first time she saw his wolf in its true form, uncorrupted and whole, she had wept. It was beautiful. He was beautiful. The court adjusted, slowly, grudgingly. A border village, nobody as the Alpha King's mate, was not what anyone had envisioned, and the whispers followed Marin through every corridor and every hall. She heard them call her the stray, the charity bride, the girl who got lucky. She let them talk. She had spent her life being underestimated, and she had long since stopped needing the approval of people who did not know her name. But Calder stood beside her, at every public function, his hand on the small of her back, his expression daring anyone to speak their objections aloud. No one did, and slowly, the whispers changed. The court watched the king sleep through the night for the first time in over a year. They watched the color return to his skin. They watched the tremors leave his hands. And gradually, grudgingly, they began to understand what she had done for him, what they had done for each other. Orla predictably took full credit. "I told you, physical proximity was the key," she said, with the satisfied expression of a woman who had been right about everything from the beginning. Hadrian said nothing, but Marin caught him smiling once, a small, private thing when he thought no one was watching. She decided not to mention it. Some gestures were better left unacknowledged. On their second wedding night, the one that counted, the one they chose, Marin stood in front of the court in a dress that was not borrowed and spoke vows that she meant. Calder's hand was steady in hers. His voice did not waver. Months later, Marin woke to pale morning light filtering through the curtains. Calder was still asleep beside her, his breathing deep and even. One arm was draped across her waist, holding her close, his hand resting against the gentle swell of her stomach, where new life was growing. No nightmares, no fog. No hollow waiting to drag him under. Marin watched him for a moment, warmth flooding through her until it ached. Then she settled back against his shoulder, closed her eyes, and they slept.